All right. We are back with Matthew. We are starting with chapter 1. I've got my, I've got my Rose phone over here with the Bible on it, and she's got a Bible in her hand, and I've got my big notebook. I had to break out the big one. So if you see me turning pages, that's what I'm turning pages on. And we got to discussing it, and I was supposed to look over chapter 1, and I was supposed to read it, and chapter 2, and kind of get the idea, so I refresh my mind on a lot of it so we can go through it. And I have a habit of seeing things shiny and wandering off, and so Ro has to keep me on, and so Ro has to keep me on track on what I'm talking about and stick to the subject at hand. But in this case, I got distracted on verse 1. Honestly, I usually just skip verse 1. I don't really pay any attention to it. To be honest, when I'm reading Matthew, I probably skip the first 17, 18 verses because I can't pronounce the names anyway. So so I skimmed through it, and I was like, all right, these are the genealogy. This is Jesus' genealogy, and it's his ancestry. But if you read verse 1, and I'm going to read it just here, it says, verse 1, Matthew chapter 1. It says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Now, in the NIV, it actually says Jesus the Messiah, which is kind of what he was saying by saying Jesus Christ. We take it for granted. We don't even notice it. I don't know that I ever really noticed it before. We just refer to him as Jesus Christ. We refer to him as the Christ. We're so used to it. We were raised in church. We think it's his last name. No, it's not. It's not his last name. It's his title. And at the time that Matthew wrote this, Matthew is a Jew writing to Jews in like about, 40, 50 AD.
Before Jesus started his ministry, he would have been known more by Joseph. It would have been Jesus Bar Joseph, and it would have gone
or
through
Jesus
his
of Nazareth or something like that.
But it would have been more connected to Joseph. But once he started his ministry, then he was connected to his true father. And that's right, where Jesus Christ, referring to him in that term, was so important.
Mm-hmm. But what grabbed me about the first verse, whenever I was writing papers in school, whenever writer friends of mine tell me they write a book, they have to grab their audience within the first, sentence, or within the first paragraph, or they really lose their audience. They lose interest in reading the rest of it. You have to grab their attention. Well, you got Matthew, who is a Jew, writing to Jews. That is specifically Jews. And his first sentence could have got him stoned.
And remember, the other apostles were appalled at Jesus choosing Matthew.
At first, yes.
At the beginning. And so would have the Jewish people he was writing to would have taken offense at it being him writing it. So then you've got his background being offensive, and then he makes a statement that slaps him in the face.
Yeah. They tried to stone Jesus for saying that he was the Messiah. Yes. So Matthew coming out and saying Jesus, the son of God, the son of David and the son of Abraham. Well, it's important for him to be the son of David and son of Abraham. It's not just that he was a descendant. This is not what Matthew is pointing out. He said Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. This means that he is identifying him as the Messiah, the promised king, and the promised Savior. The anointed one of God that the prophets talked about. Right. And then he proceeds to start talking about those are the first two prophecies Jesus had to fulfill. He had to be a son of Abraham and a son of David. And so Matthew starts with that.
Yes.
And he lines that out. And keep in mind, and I'll mention it again later probably, but the genealogies that Matthew went through were easily checked. Easily. Everybody in Israel knew their genealogy. They knew to a minute detail their ancestry back to Abraham.
And if he had lied or misrepresented anything, they would have torn him apart, and
absolutely,
there would have been no credence by anybody given to Matthew.
Yeah, because they wouldn't have listened to him at all. So he starts out with something that they can check.
Yes,
these are the facts. This is the generation. Now there are a lot of people that were descended of David, but that was a first priority. That was you had to fit into this category, or it didn't work. And he starts at around verse 2, laying it out. And there is a lot of people in the genealogy of Jesus. There's a bunch of them, but to be quite honest, most of them I can't pronounce the names of. But they're all very interesting people, and I get distracted by a few of them in there because they're my favorites. But they're one thing to keep in mind is every single one of them, from Abraham on, is flawed badly. I mean, badly.
Yes.
We would have never let these people preach in our churches. I mean, they're bad. They messed up. I mean, from all the way from Abraham and down. Abraham, the father of the faithful, got so scared when he went into Egypt that he was going to die that he sacrificed his wife. That he put her at risk just to save his own life twice.
Yes. But yet, they came back to God, and they had to correct their relationship with Him.
Mm-hmm.
To have continued and receive His blessing and be in that genealogy.
That's right. They were there not because of they're in the genealogy, and some of these people I really like because they earned their place. It wasn't a birthright for them. They weren't just the children of.
Right.
They were added to into this, and they got there because of their faith. They believed in God and they trusted God. And that's how they got there. Judah, for instance, Judah, yes. The son of Jacob, he was not the firstborn. He would have not have been the normal first choice of inheritance. His older brothers messed up. One committed incest and adultery, and the other one committed murder. And a big not just small murder, mass murder. And so Judah inherited. Because Judah did not fail his father in that regard. Judah had other failings, and he failed later to take his place seriously, I think. But he wasn't perfect.
No.
The leader of the Jewish tribes and where the Jews even get their name is from Judah. But he was not a perfect man by any means. He didn't even consider himself righteous. He did some bad things. You like Judah? I like Judah.
I like Judah because that in Judah is where we begin to find one of the women that we talked about earlier, where she falls into the genealogy. And remember, in our introduction, we mentioned that to talk about women was not a custom.
That's right.
Mentioning them, the importance of it in the scriptures of the New Testament is that they were being complete with their stories. Mm-hmm. They were being honest about everything. And so in Judah, we see Tamar, and she had to fight for her position. Judah
had 3 sons. He had 3 sons, and the first one, he found him a wife, which was an arranged marriage. It was pretty common at the time. He found him a wife among the Canaanite women, so she wasn't even of the tribes. She was a Canaanite. So her name was Tamar, and he married her to his first son. Well, his first son was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. So according to the custom, according to the custom of the area at the time, not just Israel, it was a custom of the whole area. If the elder son married and he died without having children, which in this case he did, then his next in line, the next brother, the available one, the one one that wouldn't be married, his next brother would marry her and have a child with her, and that child would receive the inheritance of the older brother that died and carry on his name. Not, it would be, in other words, the second son would have a child, and his first son would be named after his older brother, and he would carry that lineage for him. Well, the second son didn't like this, and so he deliberately did not have a child with her. Didn't stop him from having sex with her, just deliberately did not have a child with her. And God didn't like that, and God struck him down and for being wicked. And the third son was too young to marry yet. And so Judah told her to go home and live as a widow in her father's house, which to me is his first mistake. He should have kept her in his house.
Correct. She should
as a
have
member
remained.
of his family, not send her home and send her away. Well, Judah decided not to give her his last son and not to marry his last son to her. And he defrauded her of her place and her position. And so now she's this very young girl or young woman who's a widow twice. Nobody's going to marry. Nobody. I mean, nobody wants to marry her. She has no dowry left.
No.
She has no. So her position in society has been greatly tarnished by Judah.
He's taken away the blessings that he should have
and
provided her and honored her with.
And keep in mind, she is aware that he is the leader of the household. He is the leader of the tribes. He is the leader of Israel at this point, of all the tribes. He is the patriarch. And so her son would be in line for, if she has one, would be in line for the patriarch position of the tribes of Judah. And she knows this. And so he's cheated her out of her place, or her children's place, and she's going to fight for it. And what she does, I'm not sure I can condone what she did or Judah did, but she decided Judah was coming to town, so she dressed up as a prostitute and enticed him in, and he came into her, and he paid her with, it was a pledge. He was actually going to pay her with a goat, but he didn't have it with him, so he gave her a pledge. Well, what she wanted was his signet, his bracelets or cord, anyway, that was his bracelet, and his staff. Now, keep in mind, his signet, that's like his ID card. That would be like our driver's license now. I mean, that's his ID. They would, whenever they wrote a thing, they would wind it up, and that would be his seal on it, an official document. And if it had that seal on it, she's now basically his power of attorney. She can sign things for him now. She has his seal. And she has his staff, which was given to him when he became the leader of the tribe. That is a symbol of his leadership of the tribe. So he gave away his inheritance. He gave her his identity and his inheritance to have, just to have sex with her. Well, she conceived. And she went back to being dressed like a widow and disappeared. That harlot the prostitute wasn't there anymore.
And he did not get his things back, but he kind of passed it off at that point.
He didn't pay any attention to it. He passed it off. Well, a few months later, Tamar is found to be pregnant. And they bring her before Judah. They said, your daughter-in-law has been found pregnant. What is your judgment? And she demands to be heard. And she says, the person who owns these is the father. And she presented Judah's staff and his signet ring and his bracelet. And he told her that she was more righteous than he was. And he took her in, and she came in his house, and he raised the children as his own, as he should have. They were now his firstborn children. And she had 2 children. She had twins, one for each husband that died. And one was raised in each line.
You can read that about what Tamar did, and read that in Genesis 38, I believe.
Chapter 38. Genesis chapter 38. And she's one of my favorite people because she fought for her position in the place. She knew what she was fighting for, and she was fighting for the placement not of herself, but for her children.
But what was promised to her as being the wife of his sons.
Mm-hmm. She had a right.
He should not have had her leave his household.
That's right.
He dishonored her more than once, but one of the last ones was to have her leave his household.
Mm-hmm.
And she knew this.
And she knew that. And and that's in verse 3, by the way. It goes down. My next favorite people are down in verse 5. You get verse 5 and 6. You start talking about some people that I kind of like. You get Rahab. She's one of my favorites. She's one of my favorite people in the whole Bible. Rahab is. She was a prostitute, a harlot.
But she was not of Israel.
But she was not of Israel. She was from Jericho. And now remember, God told him to kill everybody in Jericho. They marched around it. The walls came down. They were supposed to kill everybody there and burn it to the ground. Nobody was ever going to live there again. That's this place they're at. And Rahab knew they were coming. I mean, Israel was huge. They've been wandering around in the wilderness out there in the desert. There is a lot of them. And so when they picked a direction and they headed towards Jericho, Jericho knew they were coming. And Rahab knew they were coming. And she was well aware of their God and that he was the true God. And that they followed this pillar of fire at night and this pillar of cloud in the day and all the miracles that took place. This didn't happen in a vacuum in Israel, for Israel out in the wilderness. Everybody knew. Everybody around there knew what was going on. So when they were coming, Rahab knew they served the real God. And she pleaded for her life to God.
She protected the two that were sent ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And
the two spies that went into Jericho, she took her moment.
Yes. And from that, she took her moment to also declare, ask for a blessing from God.
Mm-hmm.
But in also doing that, she made aware that she recognized the true God, as he said, which gave her an opening to come into the Israel and
mm-hmm.
be accepted.
In her plea for her life, she never actually asked to join Israel. I think that might have been presumptuous on her part, or she felt that way. It seems that to me. She just pleaded for her life and her family's life.
Yes.
And it wasn't just her that was saved. It was everybody she could get into her house. Anybody that would listen to her, there's a lesson for you. Anybody that would listen to her, that she could get to believe and to come into her house, were saved. God did not destroy them. But she was brought into the tribe of Israel because she married what it's called they refer to him as a prince of Israel. Back in Joshua chapter 2 is when all this, 2 and 3 is when this happens. And he's called a prince of Israel. Well, he's a prince of Israel because he's a descendant of Judah. And he's in line. And he's in line, and his name is Solomon. But he marries her.
And God blessed her because she protected his people.
He protected her. She protected his people, and he arranged for her to be married into the bloodline.
Yes.
To be married into the lineage. Now, so far, we have a Canaanite woman who later Israel is supposed to kill all the Canaanites. But this is a Canaanite woman, Tamar. And now we have a woman from Jericho who was condemned to death, and she ended up in the bloodline. Her son, actually, is named Boaz. Boaz is an interesting guy too. Boaz is get to my right paper. Boaz is listed as a just man. Boaz is a good man. He is a righteous man before God. And he comes into play in the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, because Ruth, who is a Moabite, who is a cursed people. The Moabites, by the way, descended from Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter. That's the Moabites. So they're not favored by God in general. And to be quite honest, Naomi and her husband never should have been in Moab in the first place, but they went.
They left when there was a hardship in the land, and instead of waiting and trusting God, they left. Which they weren't fully blessed for leaving.
Well, no.
He died.
Naomi's husband, I can't remember his name, he died. Both their sons died. It was a hardship. It was a bad thing. And
Naomi realized that she had left God's favor and she was going to go home, even if it meant she went home alone. But Ruth was faithful.
Yeah, Ruth said, what was it? Your God is my God, your people is my people, and where you live, I'll live. Or not necessarily in that order, but that's what she said. And when she got there, they were poor. They didn't have anything. They came in. They came in and she was gathering at the edges of the fields like a pauper because they were just trying to find some food. And Boaz saw her because Naomi had her deliberately harvest in the field that was of their kinmen of Boaz. And Boaz saw her. And
it would have been a field that she would have inherited.
Yeah, it may have been hers anyway.
Boaz, when she left, Boaz was tilling and that field became a field that he
Now remember the genealogy I mentioned? Everybody knew their genealogy. Well, the land that you could own in Israel was dictated by your genealogy. It was passed down in families. It was passed down in the lineage. You couldn't own. You could lease it. You could possess it for a time, but you could not own that land because it always went back to the original families. You couldn't keep it. Well, Ruth had a claim through Naomi. She had a claim to the property, but she, according to in their culture, she would have had to have married a kinsman to do it. She would have had to have married somebody to get into that line, but they would have inherited it. And there was actually another kinsman involved. There was a prior one that had a prior claim. He was closer related, and Boaz went to him, and the guy, he had what's called I guess in real estate it's called first right of refusal. That's what he had, and he did refuse because he already had children. He couldn't raise somebody up in Naomi's husband's name or her children's name. He already had children with an inheritance, and so he passed. Boaz did not. Boaz married Ruth. He loved Ruth, and they had who was their son?
Boaz was impressed with Ruth's
Obed.
faithfulness to Naomi. He knew that she was not from Israel, and yet he saw a woman who was honorable and faithful, and he did love that.
And Ruth got to be King David's grandmother. That's so, and her mother-in-law was Rahab. There's a fun one. Her mother-in-law was Rahab, became Rahab, her second mother-in-law with Naomi. Boaz's mother was Rahab, and her grandson became King David. And so she was placed right into the middle of it, and because of her faithfulness and her declaration of belief and her loyalty to Naomi.
Not someone who was perfect, not someone who had even grown up knowing the rights and the laws, but someone who was willing to accept God for who as the one true God, and to be faithful to that. And God can use the people whose hearts and minds are on Him. Okay.
Bathsheba, I'll just include all the women that were included in the genealogy. Might as well mention them.
Yeah.
Bathsheba is not mentioned by name. She is identified as, and I'll read it here in just a second. She is identified as the woman who was Uriah's wife. That's Bathsheba. It was David's wife and King Solomon's mother. But she is mentioned in there. She's not mentioned by name, but she is included. And that's a big deal in itself. She's way ahead of me. I wouldn't mention. So she's
she had a place, and honestly, she did not live a real honorable life at times. But she was the mother of Solomon.
And she did fight for Solomon.
She did fight for Solomon.
Solomon was not firstborn of David. He was not the firstborn of David, but he was the rightful king. And she fought for that. He had older brothers.
Yeah.
From other wives. So Solomon wouldn't have necessarily inherited. In fact, there was a war. There was a conflict. He had brothers that wanted the lineage, and there was a conflict. But she fought for Solomon, and because David had promised the kingdom to Solomon, he had promised Bathsheba that, and she wasn't going to let her child's place be discarded. And so she did fight for that, and so she did get a place in that regard for being Solomon's mother, if not for being David's wife. There is a whole long list of kings. After that, there's Manasseh, who was a very bad king. Bad, very bad. But after him, there was a guy named Josiah. One of my favorite kings. He was a child when he became king. He had a steward over him. I forget how old he was, but he was less than 10. He was little.
Yes.
He was a kid when he took the throne. But by the time he got to be 16, now he was taught righteousness, not necessarily from his father Manasseh or grandfather Manasseh, whichever one he was, but he was an evil guy. But somebody taught Josiah about God, And Josiah grew up believing God. Now, if you want to know why why they were being taken into Babylon, how bad they got, Josiah, when he was 16 years old, had the priest cleanse the temple.
Yes.
They had to clean it out. And you want to know what they found? I was absolutely dumbstruck by this. They found the scripture. They cleaned out the temple and they found the Bible. They had lost the scripture. Not only were the priests not reading it to the people, they didn't even know where it was.
Makes it hard to follow something if you can't
and so
renew your heart and mind to the scripture, which we are blessed. We have on our phones. We have so many ways that we can. And it is important that we renew our minds.
I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine if the pastor or the preacher at your church or the pastor of your church not only never read the Bible, never preached from it, didn't even have one? This is where Israel was. They had no idea. And so he commanded that they not only bring the scripture out, they brought it out and they read it to him. And he fell down before God and rent his clothes and because he thought he was doing well. He was doing everything he knew, and he fell so far short of what he was supposed to be doing. And so they brought this in, and he had it read to the elders of the tribes, and he had it read to the people, and they all swore to obey it. But Josiah was a good king. God's reward for him for being a good king was that he promised them that they would not be taken into captivity during his lifetime. It happened within 10 years after. Yeah. He died in battle, and his sons took over. They were not as good at kings as he was, and they ended up going into Babylon.
Jealousy, greed, all of those things that often took them away from worshiping God and listening to Him. They may half-heartedly worshipped, but they didn't often listen. And when they didn't listen, God couldn't bless them, and the blessing was waiting, but He doesn't give it just because you follow that line. There still has to be a connection and a worshiping and a opening of your heart before He can give that blessing.
We got time for the last part?
Let's do it.
Okay. The last part starting at verse 18, it talks about Joseph and the angel and the birth of Jesus. And it mentions the last woman in his lineage.
But it also, it's
his mother Mary.
It would have been the third, the third message of prophecy.
The third prophecy.
Which was of Mary. And the importance of that is that people could have tested Mary. And we talked about it before, that it wasn't, that Joseph didn't really find out secretly. Other people came to him and told him that she was pregnant.
Right.
And she declared that she had not been with a man. She was adamant about it. And she declared what she was told. So the information was there to remind them and to guide them back to what the words of the prophets were, right. that the Messiah would be born of a virgin.
And this was the third prophecy that Matthew mentions.
Yes.
The virgin birth. And Joseph believed it. Joseph, I don't believe that this was a secret. The way Matthew talks about it and the way he mentions it, it's common knowledge that this is what they believed at the time. That Joseph believed that Mary had not betrayed him, had not been unfaithful. He married her. He raised the son. He adopted him, raised him as his own, as is their custom, as what he was supposed to do. But he believed he was of a virgin birth. He was a divine child.
And we talked a little bit about the fact that in the Jewish faith, if a child was adopted and it was the first child, it had that son had the rights of the first son and could never be taken away.
That's right.
Even the man could have other children. He could disown those children, but he could not disown the child he adopted.
Right. And it didn't matter. And in this case, he's the oldest.
I want to say something first.
Okay.
The importance with that is we are adopted. We are in the lineage we are adopted in through Jesus Christ, and we cannot lose it except on our own.
Which means that God can never kick us out. He cannot disown us. Not that he would, but by his own laws, he can't. And we have equal share. We have equal inheritance with the eldest. If you were adopted and you were younger than the older child that they already had, you immediately inherited you had an equal portion or equal inheritance with the eldest. And Christ refers to us as having joint heirs, we being joint heirs with him, because we are adopted. And so we have a place that can't be taken away. Okay. And
you go ahead.
Well, I was talking about Joseph is listed as a just man. He is a kind man. He is a good man. He did not want to harm Mary. He cared about Mary. He really didn't want to, but he was going to divorce her. But the angel came and said not to. That told him that it was a virgin birth. She wasn't lying. It was accurate. And the way Matthew talks about it is common knowledge. This is something that Joseph told people. This is something that Mary told people. This was not a secret. That what they believed in this regard. This was not something that they hid. So Matthew knew this. And what's interesting to me is that Jesus had brothers, and that were from Joseph, and he had sisters, and Mary was still alive. All of this could be checked. Matthew was writing things down that people could just go down the street and ask him, "Is this what happened?" And
the scribes would have known it. They would have known that all of that was to come to pass.
And when, which we'll cover in chapter 2. But they knew.
Yes.
And there was no excuse. Anything else on chapter 1?
Nope, I think we got it.
All right. Next time we'll try to do chapter 2. All right. Talk to you later.